Hello, friends, and welcome to the Interworld podcast, where we explore the intersection of personal and collective transformation. My name is Yasha S. Wagner, and I'm a PhD researcher in the field of psychology, well-being, and spirituality, as well as the founder of the Interworld Institute for Inner World Peace. You can learn more about our nonprofit initiatives by going to interworld.org. Today, I have the great honor and privilege of speaking with our special guest, Akacia Rose. Akacia has received the degree and title of being an Ayurvedic doctor. And so Akacia is a skilled healer that works with clients in Loveland, Colorado. Akacia is also an avid flower farmer and an incredibly gifted musician who actually builds her own ngonis, which are an instrument that I'm excited to learn more about today. So, without further ado, here's our conversation with Akacia. Hey, so welcome to the podcast. How's it going?
I'm happy to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy you're here. So I feel that the bio likely didn't give full justice to who you are, and I'm curious if you want to introduce yourself to our audience a little more, just share with us your journey, your story, and some of your work.
Yeah. Yeah. Happy to. Um, so my name is Akacia, and um I've been on this journey of being very fascinated with the human body, with wellness and health for a very long time. When I was 8 years old, my stepmother, whose name is Janny, came into my life, and she was a yoga teacher, and she brought with her this language of the chakras and this kind of deep science of yoga. And when she came into my life, it was like she brought a language to me that I already knew, but I didn't have words for. And it sparked something in me. And so from a very young age, I started exploring, and she was a Rolfer as well, which is a type of body work. She took me through a very transformative 10 series, as they do in Rolfing, when I was 13. And it changed so many things about how I felt in my body and how I felt the world received me. And so one of the first very adult decisions that I made when I was 19 was to go study Rolfing and follow in her footsteps. And I did that and practiced Rolfing for a number of years until a very kind of it was a very vast injury happened to my back, which pretty much took my life and turned it 90 degrees and put me on a whole different path, because my body was quite crippled from that injury. And so I kind of set off on a journey, because I was living in Crested Butte, Colorado at the time, and I was a biker, and I was a skier, and I was a raft guide, and I was a rock climbing guide, and I was a ski instructor, and I was all the things. And I was also Rolfing, and everything I did asked of my body. My body was my vehicle for purpose in the world. And then my back, my spine just kind of burst, right? And that set me off on a long, winding journey of living out of a backpack for 4 years and traveling to and fro. And in that time, I encountered Ayurveda for the first time. And again, the spark, there was something where it was like, what is that? I want to know more about that. And so it took me a few more years after that kind of initial spark to find my way to Boulder, Colorado, where I did a 4-year training to become an Ayurvedic doctor, and graduated as a practitioner in 2016. And that was the first time I started practicing in private practice, and graduated as an Ayurvedic doctor in 2018, and have been in practice ever since. Yeah.
Wow, what a journey. It's fascinating. There's some synchronicity there. I broke my back last year, And one of the first guests on this podcast was actually speaking about Rolfing. So, um, yeah, there's some overlap. Can you just repeat the person that influenced you in your youth, what the relationship was, and if you want to share their name?
Yeah. She was my stepmother. She is
Okay.
my stepmother. And her name is Janny
Okay.
Wed. And she's been a very deeply profound influence on me and continues to be. She's a very wise woman. Yeah.
Hmm.
hmm
Beautiful. Yeah, I love noticing when we have these like very early seeds planted really in our childhood that kind of guide our soul journey and our path and purpose. I think it's really special when people have that sort of opportunity to follow all the way from childhood, a kind of spiritual path and calling. And it's also so special when that can be connected to kind of wise people and mentors in our lives and so on. So,
Yeah, I
um,
often think about how, I don't even know if I know who I would be if I didn't have her come into my life. She brought such an important piece of myself back to me in meeting her. And so yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing how I think, and this comes to Ayurveda, it's like these soul sparks, like there's things that happen where I think we have kind of a purpose for being here, and it kind of lights up something aligns, and we can bring that into the idea of constitution and the vehicle that the constitution is for our soul through the Ayurvedic lens. Um, but she was one of those important sparks that it woke something up in me, like I said, that I already knew, but didn't have language for in this body and in this lifetime.
yeah,
Yeah.
something that it conjures up what you're sharing. I think this is one of the deepest topics, and I love when it's touched on. Somehow, if it's touched on at all, it's often early in an episode, but this is one of the deepest topics I feel and close to my heart as this sense of soul and how there's this dimension to our being that can transcend the limitations of our physical body and you're describing it as like these subtle calling towards your purpose, like hints or sparks leading you somewhere. But what it brought up for me is how that also relates to like the nature of time, because it's sparking something because you know it's already there. So I think there's this way that it calls us forward to what we might see as the future, but it's rooted in, I feel the soul, our sense of soul is ultimately rooted in like a remembrance of a timeless dimension of our being that precedes our birth as well. And like that
Mhm.
direct remembrance of soul is like how we can get in tune with that experientially. So yeah.
Beautifully said. Yeah.
I have a question for you. So I know that you're a flower farmer. You just told me this the other day, which was a revelation and is super cool. And I'm so curious, and I want to hear, what is it like to be a flower farmer? What does it mean to be a flower farmer? And we can kind of keep digging deeper, no pun intended, into the flower farming soil and topic here for a few minutes, but maybe to start, I'm curious like how that relates to your journey and how did you end up doing that?
Mm, that's a good question. I think there's a profound energy in this world that we call beauty. And it feels to me like in this lifetime, beauty is quite the pursuit, like how to make life beautiful, how to be a beautiful person. And that doesn't necessarily mean physically beautiful, but how to be someone that creates beauty in this world. And when I think of beauty, one of the first and most pure representations of beauty in this world are flowers. It's almost like they come here just to be in beauty. And I was given the middle name Rose when I was born. And so I've carried this very strong association with that flower my whole life. One of my first memories it's not my first memory, but it's one of the moments when I started to become very conscious as a child, was my 5th birthday. my dad gave me a really high quality bottle of rose essential oil. And I coveted this tiny little bottle. And I carried it with me through my whole life, all the way into college. And then I tragically lost it in college because, that's what happens. And every time I would smell that scent, it would bring me back to when I was 5. And so there's this deep association with the rose. And throughout my life, I've learned more and more about roses and the vibration that roses carry, which is the vibration. They would say it vibrates, if you test the physical matter of the rose, that it vibrates at a very, very high frequency. And some people would say that is the frequency of love, right? And so we associate roses with love, and we give roses to express our love and our care. And so I think that I started getting more into, I was gardening, and then this very amazing book came into my life called Cut Flower Garden by Erin Benzakein. She's very much a leader in the cut flower world. And she's a magical being. And I started perusing this very beautiful, it's just like the photography and the layout, everything about it is just so exquisite. And I was like, I want to grow flowers that I can harvest and gift and arrange and make art out of, rather than flowers that are in a landscape where you want to leave them because you want them to be a part of that landscape. I want to create a garden that I can give myself permission to harvest from. And so that kind of set me off on this whole journey of growing flowers and harvesting and cutting. And what's really become the big exciting piece for me is making art out of making arrangements out of living beings that are here to carry the expression of beauty and fertility into this world. So, and it's been amazing because I studied Ayurveda, and I was practicing Ayurveda before I really came fully into the flower world. And it's been amazing to experience the interplay, because Ayurveda is an observation of the elements. And in order to sprout a seed, we need all of the elements, right? We need the soil and the earth. We need the water. We need the fire from the sun. We need the air. It's like we need the ether. We need the space for the beauty to be occupied in the plant, to the being of the plant to occupy. So it's all just the flowers and the seeds and the soil and the growing just continues to teach me about this other thing that I've studied, which is called Ayurveda, which is all about observing nature and understanding that we are what we see outside of ourselves. So it's been this very catalytic teacher in my life, because one thing that I know about myself from an astrological standpoint is that my North Node is in Sagittarius. And Sagittarius, this is in Western astrology, is the truth seeker, right? The one who wants to know the truth. And Ayurveda is a form of truth, right? Music, this universal language, is a form of truth that goes beyond words into the realm of emotions. Seeds are one of the most true things that I interact with in my life. Plants. To put a seed in soil and watch the seed germinate and sprout, and to know what the conditions of the soil need to be, and the proper light, and all of the different elements, it feels like that, we have screens and we have all these things that we interact with that are somewhat artificial, right? But the seeds are so deeply real, and we've been interacting with seeds and propagating plants for so much of our history that it's yet again another spark of remembrance, like you said. Yeah.
Wow, it's so rich. So glad that there's so much depth and dimensionality there to this topic. Thank you for sharing all of that. The first things you started sharing about beauty just reminded me. So we have a Sufi teacher who, Natanel, he's also going to be on the podcast and always shares this Sufi teaching. It's very mysterious to me. I'm still trying to understand it, but the teaching is God is beautiful and loves beauty. He has all kinds of interpretations of what that really means. But that's what you're reminding me of. And I also, so Rose is your given middle name,
Hmm.
and Acacia is your given first name?
No.
Oh, okay. They're both a plant.
Hmm. Yeah,
And I think the acacia plant is also a very special plant.
hmm, yeah, it is.
Um, yeah.
Mhm.
They both, I think, have some meaning, but there's this magic to our names too. Speaking of the soul as well, there's like this esoteric magic encoded in what is our purpose, that we can discover through our names and the meanings and stories of our names. So it's cool that you've done that. I'm curious if you want to share any more while we're on this topic about the meaning of the rose, or if you feel like you've covered it with this symbolism of love. The things that come up for me are, this is maybe less of a felt sense experience level of it, but more just like there's I guess the Rosicrucian order, right? And the whole lineage of, I guess they call it the Rosy Cross, and then there's also the whole um, feminine mysteries of the rose. So I don't know too much about those things, but those are some of the associations that I have with that image. So I
Mhm.
don't know. And yeah, I don't know if you want to share anything more about that or not.
I don't know if I have a lot more to say, except, well, everybody knows what a rose is, right? The roses have somehow presented themselves forward to humanity as like a very, very known plant, and there's certain plants that have so much power. Tobacco is one of those, right? Everybody knows what tobacco is. It's a plant. It comes from a leaf. Um, and so I find rose to be, it's such an interesting teacher too, because when working with the rose, there's all this beauty in the flowers, and I grow a lot of kind of more unusual roses, garden roses that have really, really amazing fragrance, but they're also thorny and they have boundaries and they demand presence. If you're working with a rose and you get distracted and you move your arm through it, you're going to bleed. And so in that way, it has a big presence, and it's both a representation of, in a sense, you could even almost bring it to the divine feminine, right? If you think of like Kali being this energy of death and destruction and like very, very intense representation of the feminine. And then you have Durga, or you have some of the other Saraswati, you have some of the other beings that represent beauty, or the rose embodies all of those paradigms. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. I'm really glad you bring that up. The thorns. I think that is the more relatable component of it that I was looking for and missing, is like understanding how even just observing directly that, roses have this incredible enchanting allure, and yet this bite that's the thorn, and how we can just perceive that by observing and paying attention to the plant and its body and what it's like. So yeah, it's beautiful. And even just what you're sharing about flowers themselves, appearing on the planet for the sake of beauty, reminds me of the opening to New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. But I don't know if you've read that, talking all about flowers, but it's just incredible that the geometry, the form, like the nature of flowers, there's something undeniably intelligent about it, in my view. It's like undeniably divine and sacred. There's no way to explain it other than it's cosmic art made by nature. And it's such masterful art. um, like unparalleled artwork, and for
Mm-hmm.
all of our senses, the smells, the colors. It just reminds me too of like the mystery. Like we're here on this earth, and then there's this sun, and somehow it's about the same size as the moon, but they're so far away, and it's like so intelligent, so divine. Um, yeah, so the one quick question I had was you mentioned making your own art out of flower arrangements, and I'm curious if you know if you could remind me the word. There's probably different cultural approaches to that, but I remember that there's an ancient art. I don't remember if it's Chinese or Japanese, but there's a word for the art of flower arrangement. I guess you're just doing it yourself without that context, but
I'm
if we
trying
were,
to remember
yeah.
what that is. It's Japanese, I believe. I can't remember the word in this moment. And actually, I have kind of taken from that, they do a lot of like they stick stems of either dried or fresh plants into like these spikes that hold them vertically. And it's my favorite arrangement to make using what they call flower frogs, which are these kind of spiky weights, and you can put the flowers into them and make these like very voluptuous, spilling, cascading arrangements. And the flower stems have support. So I would say actually probably the style of arrangement that I do is influenced by that. And I just can't remember the name of it in this moment. Yeah.
Well, we can probably put it in the show notes. I'm really glad to hear that it's Japanese because we're planning a group pilgrimage to Japan at the end of the year with our nonprofit. So if you want to come or invite anyone, let us know. We're going to be filming there, and they're actually giving away properties and land in Japan these days. So we're going to go check it out, and it'll be my
Wow.
first time in Japan.
Cool.
Um,
Okay.
yeah. Japan, which is actually also where this idea of forest bathing comes from, which is kind of a form of therapy through immersion in nature, which starts to become a good segue towards the healing arts, and the correlations between flower farming and uh, Ayurveda and medicine. I also know that I think modern science has found that even just putting your hands in soil has antidepressant qualities. Obviously, being outside and being active and farming flowers and so on has got to be um, one of the healthiest things for our whole overall well-being that I could think of. Being active and probably makes us flower. We probably become like the flowers we're planting.
Mm.
So yeah, those are my thoughts about that. I before we fully go into this healing direction, the one thing I want to point out from what you shared still is about the elements. You mentioned how, and this is also related to Ayurveda, but you mentioned how all the elements, the soil, the water, the sunshine, or the rain, the sunshine, and the breeze, they all need to come together to create the life of the flower. And I just want to, kind of put an exclamation point there and emphasize that. I think that that's important to linger there for a moment. My own dissertation research is all about the meaning of the elements and how they appear in different systems around the world throughout history, and in our reality. And, I think a flower is an incredibly important way to just a sec. Flower is an incredibly important way to um, recognize how the elements interplay to create something new, like pre-existing things coming together to make new life. You were talking about fertility, but there's this quality to flowers where, like the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh and the teachings of the Buddhist tradition of emptiness or anicca, sometimes I think people misinterpret that to mean that nothing exists, which may be a part of it, but ultimately it's saying nothing exists in separation from anything else. And so everything is made out of everything else. And so none of us are disconnected. We are all just another mask for the totality. And one of the best ways to illustrate that is with a flower in relation to the elements, because you think you're looking at a flower, but it's not actually a flower. The flower is empty. What you're looking at is the sunshine and the rain and the soil and the breeze and the hands that tend to the flower and the space that of emptiness that permeates the flower. All of that combined is what you're looking at. You're looking at the weather and the earth and the landscape. It's so fascinating. So I just wanted to make sure to name that because I think that's a very beautiful teaching, this understanding of how everything is made out of everything else, and the elements are the best way to illustrate that. And a flower may be the best way to represent how the elements are doing that. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Very good point, and very well said. Yeah, and we all, one of the premises of Ayurveda and a lot of the traditional sciences is that what we see outside of us, what we observe outside of us, is the exact replica of what's happening internally, right? And it's through the observation of nature and a deep ability to introspect that we can start to know what it is to be human. I had a friend the other day tell me that kind of this interbeing idea of like, if you have your feet below the level of water, like you're in a bathtub and you can see your toes poking out of the water, and they all look like individual toes, but they're just a part of the foot. It's like, that's kind of what we're talking about. There is no outside inside, but there is, right? So we're experiencing both. And that's, I think, a lot of the really wise beings who have asked these big questions of like, what am I? Like, what is this body? What is this mind? How do I interact with this world that I'm a part of and all of the other beings in it? What is actually happening here? This is like this, these are some big questions that there's some really deep answers to if we really give ourselves time to sit in that inquiry.
Beautiful. Yes, I love this metaphor that you just brought up about the toes, and I have to stick with it for a moment because there's some synchronicity there for me. I haven't heard really anyone except myself and the first person I learned this from, speak about this until now, until you, at least not for many, many years. But one way to picture what you were just talking about is in terms of dimensions. Like when we talk about what does it mean, the multidimensional nature, higher dimensions of things. Well, one of the best ways that we can try to grasp what does higher dimension mean is by looking at the lower dimensions we're already familiar with. So we know how the first, second, third dimension work in terms of space. If you picture a flat two-dimensional plane and you take a three-dimensional hand and you just like process your three-dimensional hand through this completely flat like piece of paper, for example, and you just stick your hand through the piece of paper and you pause, what you get is literally four completely separate individual flat circles. You have no idea that they're fingers, right? They're just four separate circles. But if you go up a dimension, you suddenly become fingers on one hand of a much larger reality. So that's one way that the nature of going up in dimensionality through time and space could be conceived as like, from the second to the third dimension, we're already going from these individual circles to an entire hand. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, deep stuff. And also what you said about, and I want, you're welcome to share more about this if you'd like. What you said about the outer, what we see outside of us being a replica of what's going on inside. This is central to all of our work with our nonprofit and the whole theme of this podcast. This is the main area of focus for us is what is that correspondence between the inner and outer worlds, which is why we call it Interworld Podcast and Institute. So I don't know if you want to share anything more about that. You said that that's a component of Ayurveda, so that's what really um, piques my curiosity is if you want to speak to how is that particular teaching of correspondence shared in the Ayurveda tradition in particular, and we'll just keep kind of going into Ayurveda here.
Yeah. Well, at its very, very, very root, Ayurveda is quite interesting in how it was discovered and communicated. And so the history of Ayurveda goes back into India. It's an ancient Indian Vedic science, predates Hinduism. It's very, very old. And there were these wise beings called rishis, Rishi, right? And they were very deep beings that had the ability to listen in a very profound way, introspect in a very profound way. And what they did was they sat in caves in the Himalayas in a state of meditation and in an integrated state of being in the natural world, right? Being amongst the natural world. And you could almost say, some people would say they downloaded the knowledge and then they communicated it outwardly. And when it came out of their mouths, it came out in poetry and prose. And then students started gathering at their feet and listening to the poetry and prose that was being spoken, memorizing it and passing it down. It was passed down as a verbal knowledge base for a long time before it started being written on palm leaves and so on and so forth. To now we have the Vedic texts written in many different languages. They're massive texts of lifetimes of study, multiple different interlocking systems that all communicate the nature of reality, right? What is this? And a big, when I think of the rishis and what they were communicating and what they were finding and observing, it was a combination of a deep outrospection, a deep observation of the natural world, a deep observation of the elements as they moved through their reality, and then a very deep introspection, right? And they were able to go macro in order to go micro. And at the time when this knowledge was being communicated, they were able to see through inner seeing that the body, this is way before microscopes, the body was made up of individual cells, right? Individual cells interacting to make the whole. Each of those cells, they figured out, had a semi-permeable membrane on the outside of the cell. That was an intelligent membrane that could say, you're a nutrient, come in. You're a waste, go out. You're a pathogen, stay out, right? And then even a little further than that, they knew that at the center of the cell lived the ancestral fire, the DNA, right? Mm-hmm. So through the power of intro and outrospection, we could say, they were able to see into the very vast macro and all the way to the teeniest, tiniest micro without any equipment. No telescopes, no microscopes, right? So I find that to be extremely profound, right? It's a different way of coming to knowledge than like our allopathic Western system, right? And both have their brilliances, but it starts from this very deep understanding of the outer and inner being a continuity, right? There's no difference. And if we can master understanding it, then we can achieve vitality, radiant health, longevity, which is kind of the ultimate goal of Ayurveda.
Beautiful. What a powerful introduction. If you have Any other kind of core principles or components you want to make sure that you introduce? You can. One invitation is we've already started talking about the elements, and so I'm curious about the role of the elements or Mahabhutas, which seem to appear throughout these episodes. But if you have your own kind of description of how with the role of that within the core foundations of Ayurveda, and especially in relation to health. And more than anything, you've shared with me that your flower farming informs, like the conditions for soil inform your healing work with clients and as an Ayurveda doctor. So I'm curious if you could really share about that bridge between the farming and the Ayurveda.
Yeah. Typically in Ayurveda, the way that I learned is that we always talk about the elements from the most subtle to the most dense as they trickle down into the manifestation of form of the physical reality, right? And so to introduce them, the most subtle, light, expansive is the ether. It's the element of space. It's the place where sound originates. It's the big bang, right? The big bang, like in some of the theories in the Vedic knowledge, the Om resonated through the universe and space was created, right? And then from that came the movement, and the movement is the wind element, right? So now we're going from space to wind, and the movement of wind through the space creates friction, which creates heat and fire, right? And as we get heat, we get condensation, and now we have water falling. And then we have the crystallization of the minerals in that water become earth, right? And so those are the 5 elements that we speak of, right? In TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, they speak of slightly different elements. But in Ayurveda, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the elements. And in Ayurveda, then what we do through the Ayurvedic lens is we take elements and we pair them together. And those elements start to create what we call the doshas. And the doshas are a part of our physical constitution, but they have physiological functions within the body and mind, right? So air and ether, wind and ether, air and wind are synonymous, pair together to create vata dosha, right? 2 lightest elements have an affinity for each other. The fire element, which some will say is paired with a small amount of water, is pitta dosha, the fiery one. And then the water and the earth come together to form kapha. And this is a part of what makes Ayurveda really very unique, is talking about the doshas, which are a compilation of the elements. Sometimes Ayurveda can get a little stuck on the doshas, right? We can kind of water it down and say, well, Ayurveda is just doshas, and if you're vata, you're anxious, and if you're kapha, you're overweight, and that's it, right? And it's much, 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 much bigger than that. But it's all originating from first the elements, then the doshas, and then each dosha has qualities. And that's where I actually get really interested in Ayurveda, is the qualities, right? So the air and the ether come together, and we have vata, and it's cold and it's dry and it's light and it's rough and it's mobile and it's subtle, right? And pitta, the qualities that come together to form pitta, it's hot, it's oily, it's sharp, it's penetrating, it's spreading. It's not mobile, but it has a spreading quality, right? And kapha, the earth and the water, come together, and they're static and they're stable and they're hard and they're dense and they're gross, right? They're slimy and smooth. And so on a medical level, when we start to talk about the qualities, then we can really get into, okay, well, that rash that you have on your skin is both fire and water, and it's hot, sharp, and oily and spreading. And so then we can use the opposite qualities. We can apply the science of opposites to say, well, if it's hot and spreading, we want to cool it down and we want to stabilize it. We don't want it to keep moving through the tissues, right? So that's kind of, when I think of Ayurveda, I think of the elements that then come into the form of the doshas through combining in specific ways and serving specific physiological and constitutional functions. And then this compilation of what we call the 20 gunas, these 20 opposing qualities that really go deeper in describing what is vata, what is pitta, what is kapha, and how do they go out of balance, and how can we create balance using something of the opposite nature, right? So that's kind of where that's the funnel that I think of when I think of Ayurveda, and how it starts to become medically applicable as a science of wellness.
It's interesting to me to note that there's also a rich alchemical tradition in India, and like a whole tradition of Vedic alchemy that has some connections to Ayurveda, especially in terms of like the distillation of tinctures and medicines, as well as the use of elements to refine and make more subtle the qualities of dense substances such as metals and so on. So there's a very, very rich and ancient tradition of alchemy, all the way back to uh, actually the ancient Vedic texts, which are literally thousands of years older than what most modern people tend to think of as like medieval European alchemy is what alchemy is, and the whole idea of making gold out of base metals. There's actually references to those ideas many thousands of years earlier, all the way out in India. So I find that very interesting and worth noting.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you want to add anything to those topics, you can. You also brought up like the primordial Om at the origin of the universe, and I find this kind of cosmology of the Vedic cosmology and creation of the universe in the Vedic traditions to be very interesting. And you might know more than me kind of about some of that science, the roles of the creator, sustainer, destroyer. And I've even heard it said, because you mentioned the Big Bang, and I remember, I think it was Carl Sagan when I was a teenager talking about um, like the inhalation and exhalation of the divine creating like these cycles of like the Big Bang, the whole expansion of the universe, then being retracted through cycles, just like the yugas, which I think are giant by comparison to the Western calendar system, but tiny compared to this larger cycle of the whole universe being created and then withdrawn back in and expanded again. So I know these are much more cosmic topics perhaps than some of the basic diagnosis and prescription aspect of healing work, which we'll come back to. But if you want to speak to any of that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. On the level of alchemy, I was so fascinated when I was studying Ayurveda to start to understand this. And one of the things that I remember learning when I was studying is that in India, through very, very specific processes passed from one generation to the next, right? You really have to know what you're doing. They can alchemize mercury to be taken internally as a medicine, right? And that seems impossible from the way that we relate to mercury in this Western world, right? And it's said that alchemized mercury taken internally is one of the best medicines for male virility. It is Shiva, right? So it's really good for the semen. It's really good for male fertility. And in the United States, we don't have those long-standing familial traditions, and so we don't have access to those medicines, but it is very much a part of the Vedic, Ayurvedic knowledge base is this alchemy, right? And even when we look at the classification of medicines, plant medicines, there's what does it look like? Where does it come from? Is it heating or cooling? But there's also this categorization that they give to the plants, which is this: how does this plant uniquely give medicine in this world? It may have the same qualities and the same tastes and the same effect on the doshas as another plant, but how does this plant specifically, what did it come here to specifically express? And I'm bringing that up because there's this ability to honor the more subtle realms. I think in this Western world, we get a little caught in the gross, dense realms, and we undervalue the subtlety, right? And alchemy is a very subtle science. It's a very precise science, very subtle, right? The plants have their gross, dense bodies, but they also have a soul purpose. What did they come here to bring? What did they come here to do? And this is not just communicated through Ayurveda. This is communicated through any culture that has a direct relationship to the plants and nature, that is an integrated part of that system, that the plants have souls and spirits and missions and purposes on this planet. And so that's a form of alchemy itself, just to be able to listen into the more subtle realms for the whisperings of purpose, right? So, and in Ayurveda, there's also this really amazing tenet that says that anything can be a poison and anything can be a medicine. It just depends on how you use it and for who you're using it for, right? For this person, this specific food could be very medicinal, very balancing. For this other person, another substance, that same substance could be poison, right? And so this kind of, again, blurring the lines between the inner and outer, between medicine and poison, there's a lot more subtlety going on than what we just kind of tend to default to in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up medicine and poison at the end there because, well, whether we're talking about mercury, it's exactly where I was going to go. This idea in medicine in general, and which stems from alchemy globally, that like the antidote to a poison, to a snake bite, is found in the venom. And so even the symbol of the caduceus and so on, it's all representing, even on a psychological level, that perhaps the treasure is in the problem, the solution, the thing that's trying to be shown to us, our strength might be within our weakness, within our weak spot, etc. Um, Deep stuff. You also brought up Shiva in relation to virility, and I just want to point out also that one interpretation of Shiva's blue skin is that Shiva is transmuting poison into medicine in his own being. Um, and sometimes, like the Nataraja, the dancing king depiction of Shiva, shows these symbols such as the snake, which can relate to that quality of medicine coming from venom, but also the datura flower or the toei in his hair, um, which can relate again to the medicinal properties, whether physical or psychological, contained within things that, if misused, could be toxic or dangerous, right? But sometimes even it's just the throat where the blue color is most pronounced, implying that Shiva has ingested the potentially dangerous or poisonous substance, however we want to think of that, mercury, venom, datura. I'm not an expert, but there's this ingestion of poison and this transmutation through the throat where that's held there, kind of like the tolerance of the discomfort. It's not being swallowed completely, but it's not being rejected or ejected either. Um, can't live with it, can't live without it. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to add anything, or also if you were going to add anything to the topic of the kind of cosmology and creation and so on, those cycles, feel free.
Yeah. I've been really thinking about this a lot recently, how, in a sense, what I get to do as a practitioner of Ayurveda is alchemy. Because for me, the way that I've come into a lot of my knowledge is through suffering in my body, through some really deep injury and really deep illness, right? The dark night of the soul kind of stuff, right? And the more and more I'm in this practice, and in this role as a practitioner of this really beautiful seed of truth that I get to share with people, the more I realize that it's through committing to excavating the really deep, dark, hard, sticky, venomous places in my own experience of being a human in a body and a mind, that I can more fully show up for my clients in the role that I'm holding as a guide for them. And what I've started to really realize is that what I could say is the largest tragedy of my life, starting with this back injury, descending into a lot of very deep illness in my body, is actually the greatest gift of my life, right? And the ability that I have to take that and let it teach me and then gift that to others for their own well-being and goodness is a form of alchemy, right? It's the transmutation of poison into what we might say is nectar, rasa, juice, vitality, life force. And it feels like such a great privilege to be, and quite a great responsibility as well, that I tend to learn things in my life through the direct experience of those things in my body and my being, and then in the healing and the becoming whole with that. That's then what I have to give to the world, right? And so that's been a really deep inquiry that I've been in, probably for the last year, that feels applicable to this conversation.
Very.
Yeah. And on the cosmology side, it was actually the cosmology of the Sankhya philosophy that caught me and brought me to Ayurveda. I was in Grass Valley, California, and I was participating in it was an essential oils retreat with Floricopia Essential Oils, a profound company, combined with Ayurveda and Kundalini Yoga with this man, Jaidev, who is such a wise one of our times, if you've ever heard of him. And he delivered the teaching of the Sankhya philosophy, which is basically the evolution of consciousness into matter. How does the subtle become this gross, dense reality that we experience? And the dissemination of that knowledge was so poetic in the way that he taught it. And it one of the sparks there was, there's a medical science in this world that also believes in spirit. Wow. That's connected. That's honoring more of the realms that we exist in as beings beyond the physical, right? And so that was the Sankhya philosophy, that was truly in my experience, my entry point into Ayurveda. And it's a profound philosophy to explore.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's this theme running through a lot of what you're sharing about this kind of vertical axis, right? So on this, in the dense plane, physically the elements interact, but even physical water and soil and sun, all of that might just be the earth element on a vertical axis, where the whole physical universe contains all matter, but that's just step one, right? In terms of the densities, and then there can be this vertical kind of pole or axis where the elements are stacked upon each other, not just in terms of physical air and so on, but moving through emotional, mental, up to spiritual subtleties or frequencies, right? And so I think that this is important. You even mentioned the chakras at the very beginning in relation to your stepmother. So even the chakras themselves are a great example of how these elements or Mahabhutas can be represented as being stacked vertically, representing the different densities, where the first chakra might even just be a representation of our entire physical body or the entire physical body of the universe. We think the chakras are in our body, but maybe our body is in the chakra system of our soul, and our whole body is the first chakra in
Mm.
in a way, right? Um, so I actually think that even what you're saying about the dark night and this kind of shadow work of descent, even that has to do with again, what you're talking about, consciousness becoming matter, and then our culture maybe being stuck in, let's say, a lower density, or too fixated on the denser, grosser component in some way, still there, and what it looks like to like reascend or go back and reunite with the more, as in Sanskrit, I guess you would say, Akashic levels of perhaps the chakra system. But then how do we do that? Because you're talking about this dark night and this descent, and it's like we bring light, we bring consciousness, we purify by going down in first. That's the root chakra. And this goes all the way back to flower farming because you're literally rooting down into the soil element in the dark first before you can grow up towards the light and the air and those. So it's like a flower itself is kind of like a kundalini system.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I think that I you said like evolution, right? And I like the word involution because involution is literally used as a term just to refer to this, like reverse evolution of the subtle, the mind, akasha first into involving itself into this material reality. And then sometimes transmigration can be used as the way of speaking about like the soul going back up the ladder that goes both ways, from subtle to dense and dense back up to subtle. And even, with this theme of Shiva, again, another representation can be like the nectar you're talking about, Shiva dripping the Amrita from the crown and Kundalini Shakti rising up to meet there. So, anyways, yeah, these are very rich topics, and I'd like to get into the medicine, but if you have any more thoughts you want to share before we do kind of get into our last couple of topics.
Yeah. When I think of being a little caught in density, there is a concept in Ayurveda that I work with a lot, and that is the idea that we have hundreds of channels running through our body, right? And in the Western allopathic view, we would recognize the digestive channel, the respiratory channel, the circulatory channel, right? But in Ayurveda, there's many, many, many more channels, right? And if we one example of density might be consuming the standard American diet that has a lot of density to it, right? We eat a lot of wheat and a lot of dairy and a lot of meat and a lot of sugar, right? And all of these things are heavy building foods, right? When we so consistently put so much density into our bodies, what happens through the Ayurvedic lens is that the channels become filled, they become obstructed, right? And then our ability to sense subtlety actually becomes obstructed because now we're actually existing on a physical realm and even on into a more energetic realm in this experience of density. And for something to travel through these obstructed channels takes more time. So for example, if you have really obstructed channels, often a question I might ask somebody is, when you eat that food, how does it make you feel? The answer to that is, I don't know. I have no idea, because the food has to move through these obstructed channels, the nutrients, the essence of the food, before it's ever utilized or experienced. And by the time you're experiencing that food, you can't relate it back to the food itself because it slows everything down. Everything becomes more sticky, right? So one of the things that we do in Ayurveda is how do we address the obstructed channels? How do we start to clear them out so that the body can function as the body is meant to function? You eat the food and you feel the effect and you know what causes what, and that helps you make more intelligent decisions and it reconnects you to subtlety, right? And so no wonder we're a little overly involved in density here. If we look at the things that we tend to intake through the food, the liquids we put in our body, the things we take in through our eyes, right? Even the air we breathe. There's a lot of density in this world. And so there is a way of strategically going in and reigniting the fire element in the body, which can burn off some of those accumulations in the channels of the body and start to clear things out and reconnect us to our innate sensitivity, which we all have, right? When we're born, we're purely instinct. We know without knowing, right? And then that gets more dense as we age, unless we know how to keep the channels open, free, breathing, alive, clear, right? And that is one way, in my opinion, because Ayurveda is such a physical science, in that a lot of the answers to the issue of density and the inability to remember and to ascend back into subtlety can be addressed through the digestive system, can be addressed through the gut, can be addressed through the food that we intake. There are some very applicable suggestions and solutions so that we can become more connected to subtlety. And I see that happening with the people that I work with. And it's a beautiful, beautiful process to witness someone becoming more reconnected to these very whispering, the realms that whisper at us, that don't yell at us, it's the subtlety.
Yeah. I want to share this comment because we're talking so much about density and subtlety. And I think that it's important when we talk about kind of ascension, this idea of coming back to a subtler frequency, not staying as trapped or stuck in a lower density. I think it's important when we talk about that and we use that language to also explore, or at least for me to place kind of a footnote about what it means to include and transcend something. I want to note that because I think that the same way that a lot of what dominates our mass media and our kind of pop culture, let's say, the dominant cultural paradigm, let's say, might be this stuckness in these lower frequencies or in this very dense dimension of reality and materialism and so on, at the superficiality, right? At the same time, I think that in the spiritual subcultures and like the spiritual and new age movements, there can also be this trick that happens where we like prematurely try to escape reality without dealing with it first, directly. So I just wanted to note that because I think there's a difference between engaging with something and gaining some degree of mastery in order to be able to then move on from that, and keep growing, as opposed to pretending to renounce something as a way of bypassing it. And I think that's actually one of the issues, on the flip side, like the compensatory issues, is that we don't want to deal with reality as it is. And so we might want to pretend that, oh, I'm already this super woo woo enlightened situation. But like the Bhagavad Gita, for example, recommends karma yoga over renunciation. So ultimately, we need to act, we need to be engaged in the world. And from that space of gaining some mastery in this reality that we're embodied and incarnate in, then that sets a foundation upon which we can build and explore a more spiritual aspect of existence. So I did just want to name that. I don't know if I really was able to articulate it so well, but it's an important note. And I have a question for you. It's kind of a funny question. In Chinese medicine, there's always this idea of the meridians, which are like the channels you're talking about, because there's many different systems and chakra and sub-chakra systems within systems. It's not just some primary centers. But I don't know if there's a word used for those channels in Sanskrit, so I'm curious about that because I always use meridians from the Chinese traditions. And then, ironically, on the flip side, in Chinese medicine, they're all working with these acupuncture and acupressure points, um, but I don't know the word, so I call them nadis, which is from the Sanskrit. So it's a little entanglement there. Maybe you could clear some of that up for us.
Yeah. So the nadis, you could say, are the channels. And then there's the three primary nadis, the central nadis, but they're part of a larger system, right? And the marmas are what we would call in Ayurveda, what we would call those points. They're not the exact same as what they communicate through the traditional Chinese medicine. There's fewer of them, but there is a whole sector of Ayurveda and the kind of the body work portion of Ayurveda, the body therapies portion of Ayurveda, that there is marma therapy that can be done.
Wow, this is so helpful. I'm so grateful to for this correction. Okay, so the nadis, like the Shushumna nadi, the solar and lunar and central channels, those are actually, I can let go of meridians now. That's actually what the nadis are. And then the points, the acu points, let's say, not that it's the same system, but that they're like points of energy would be marmas and not nadis, and I didn't even know that word, so that's helpful. Thank you.
And actually, the way that it was described to me that the marmas were discovered was, there were physicians that were surgeons in the Vedic traditions and that were feeding into the knowledge of Ayurveda and communicating information that we can study. There's Sushrut, who was a surgeon himself. And in doing surgery, they saw that if they cut specific places in the body, there was a stronger response of the body. It was more dangerous to cut these particular points. And that's where they came up with the marmas, where they believed that there was this concentration of energy in these very specific points on the body. And when you were doing surgery, it was in your best interest to avoid obstructing or cutting through, slicing those particular points. And that's my understanding of kind of even how the marmas originated, was really through the lens of what do we need to do if we have to go in surgically into a body? What do we need to know about where we're actually incising into the body?
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Valuable knowledge here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, well, even that connects to what you already started describing of allowing energy to flow and things, our life in general, and substances, etc., to flow unobstructed and fluidly. Um, so I want to fluidly allow space if you want to go more into any aspects of the healing work of Ayurveda and your own healing work. Uh, with the time we have, I do have a few more questions as well. But if there's anything you feel like you want to make sure you get to before we wrap up, I also want to keep a space for that. And if not, I'll ask some more prompting questions.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll describe a little bit how I tend to work with people, because it's a little backwards from where we might think we often start with Ayurveda. Usually people come into Ayurveda wanting to know, what's my constitution? Who am I? Right. And the interesting thing is that most people are relatively imbalanced, right? This world creates imbalance, and it's up to us to figure out how to tend to ourselves to create balance despite this constant chronic pull towards imbalance, right? And so most people come into my practice relatively imbalanced, farther away from their constitution, farther away from who they are, right? So oftentimes we start less on the realm of constitution. Not that it's not a part of the conversation, but more it's what is the expression of imbalance in your body right now? And how is that pulling you away from feeling at home in yourself? How is that making life in this body feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable, right? And as we go through the work, we might talk more about who you are and your constitution and your tendencies as a result of that, right? So it actually starts with kind of this tendency that a lot of people are there, they have obstructed channels. Some people's channels are way too clear and they're OCD or super anxious or high sensitivity, right? That might be another different expression of imbalance in a body in this time. And so what I really love to do with my clients is to meet them where they're at right now. And then as we start to let their body teach us about its unique needs, wants, desires, what's balancing, what's imbalancing, what it might be highly sensitive to, what might be very medicinal for it, we start to gain more familiarity with like, who is this person and what is their what is their essence? And our essence is our constitution, right? And so, and the on a more realistic level, what does that look like? We're working with diet. What do you put into your body? How are you digesting it? How are you eliminating the wastes, right? What foods will be more balancing for your body in its current state? What foods will be more imbalancing? And that might look like if you have really clear channels and you have a lot of dryness in your system, you may not want to have a cruciferous vegetable-based diet, right? You might not want to eat Brussels sprouts every single day because they might actually provoke the excess air in your system. And so we're working on this very individual level and letting the body teach us what it needs as we go along. And it's a very organic process because of that. There's no protocol. It's just the listening, the observation, the response, the experimentation, the listening, the observation, the response, the experimentation. It's just this very organic process. And what I end up witnessing in my practice is this coming home to self, right? The ways that we've been disconnected and either too dense or too light or too fiery or whatever it might be, the expression of the elements in an imbalanced form, as you know, that make the pendulum of that person swing between extremes, right? Constantly swinging between extremes. As we start to get the pendulum to stabilize, right? Because we're not doing this and then reacting to it and then doing this and reacting to it. We start to become more familiar with ourselves, right? We start to remember who we are, right? And that kind of starts to reveal the constitution. And the way that I tend to see constitution through the lens of Ayurveda is that it's the exact right recipe. It's the exact perfect vehicle for your soul to carry out its mission in this lifetime. It needed exactly this body, exactly these minds. It needed these elements in specific proportions. It needed to have certain tendencies of what calls to it and what it's averse to. And that is our constitution is the vehicle for that. There is no good constitution and bad constitution, and my constitution is better than your constitution. It's that my constitution is exactly perfect for me to carry out the mission that I came to carry out, right? And it's my job to know myself so profoundly and so deeply and to care for myself so thoroughly that I can only exist in a state of balance, which is me. This is the land where I know myself, right? And so, and it's not that easy. This is a lifelong, we'll never be done with this work. It continues for the rest of our lives, right? But there's this constant deepening which is in a sense coming home to our constitution. And I think that that's, we have these things that pull us away from ourselves, and through the lens of caring for ourselves and knowing ourselves very thoroughly and understanding how to intelligently be well in whatever that looks like for us individually, which is going to be very unique, that we can come home to ourselves. And that's kind of in my work with Ayurveda. It's my favorite part of what I do, and what I get to observe is that coming home to self.
Wow, incredible. Um, I resonate very deeply with everything you just shared. Some of it is familiar, but the way you're presenting it in relation to these topics feels original and new in many ways. And I'm honestly a little speechless. Like I had questions and there's things I can ask about Ayurveda, but it's so on point what you're sharing. And it's so empowering, this idea that our constitution is perfect for us to fulfill our soul's mission. And so our job in coming into greater balance is just to come back home to knowing ourselves. And it's a process that can take lifetimes and is infinite, but that's very powerful, that sense of the perfect ingredients combined from the infinite totality that we're a flowering of. It's like in the exact combinations for our own unique flowering. No one has the same exact thumbprint actually or fingerprint as we do. And our fingerprint actually looks like kind of like a rose or a flower. It's cool. So yeah, yeah, it's
And
I honest
also,
yeah, go ahead.
in that way too, one thing I want to say, which really struck me when I was learning Ayurveda, there was a day I was driving somewhere, and I was probably in my first or second year of school, and there was something happening on the road in front of me, and there was like a little mini accident, and the car in front was stopped and the car behind was stopped, and the man in the car behind got out and went up to the car in front of them and started really road raging on this car, kicking the car. It was scary. It was like, whoa. And I was looking at this happening and I was like, oh my goodness, that man is not an angry person. He has an imbalance of the fire element, and he can't help but be extremely volatile and explode, because the fire element in his body is so provoked. He's just on edge, ready to explode at any moment. It's not who he is inherently. He's not an angry person. He's a good person. He's a gentle person, but he's imbalanced. And the imbalance, when we're in a state of imbalance, we can't help but express in ways that maybe aren't as beautiful, because we're not home. We're not with ourselves. We're in a state of being askew, right? And so that perspective has also brought for me a lot of compassion into how I see the world through the lens of Ayurveda. No one is meaningfully expressing imbalance. It's that we are almost the victims to it until we know how to start to gain traction over it and funnel it back into a more beautiful expression.
There's also some sort of mysterious intelligence to how all of it is showing us something. Like there's an artwork to even the imbalances on some level. There's like this larger overarching collective fingerprint that's happening. Like I've heard it said, and like we tend to judge like, oh, this is a drunkard or something like this, but it's like if you watch them and observe them, it's like maybe this is just the perfect representation of that archetype, and it's just showing us that. So I think that there's something fascinating there. I could go further into Ayurvedic medicine here, and maybe in the future we will. We're actually creating an academy, I've mentioned, beyond this podcast, of courses, libraries of courses, and be curious to chat with you about that because the material you're sharing is so profound. I think it would be very enriching and relevant to create something there and come back as well for further conversations. The point of the academy is to like for people not just to hear an episode, but actually study a topic, different topics that they want to study like this. And it's hybrid, so there'll be online content courses, but also people can come in person. We have our eco village here, uh, which we're developing. I've thought about calling some aspects of it the Desert Rose because we're on some dry, flat land here. We're looking to create more of a verdant oasis within that landscape. So, um, yeah, I think that there's possibilities in the future to keep exploring Ayurveda with you. I'm really grateful for everything you've shared today. And before we finish, there's one last topic I want to get to, and that is music. And I have had the wonderful experience of experiencing just a little bit of your music a long, long time ago. And I just remember it being very magical and incredible. So I would love to hear your perspective on music, your story and journey with music, and how that brought you to the Ngoni in particular, what you can share with us about the Ngoni, why you have chosen to work with the Ngoni in particular as your instrument of choice. And then at the end, I want to hear about the fact that you build your own Ngonis and create these instruments. So yeah, why don't we start with the musical journey?
Mm. It's interesting because the musical journey, at one point I had a conversation with an astrologer and he said, you're here to be a teacher and a performer. And so the exploration of Ayurveda and the understanding of that science and the teaching of that science has been kind of a tandem journey with music. And in the time that I was learning and studying Ayurveda, I was also deeply blossoming in my career as a musician. And so it feels like, again, another seed of my soul. Like there's very specific things that I'm called to do, and music has been one of them. And I had a relationship to music as a child, but I wouldn't say it was a huge part of. I played the piano, I sang in choir. There was things, but after my back injury, I was just really caught. And the first instrument that really caught me was the handpan. This was way back in the day, before really handpans were heard. And I had an experience where I was in a forest in southern Washington and I heard this instrument. And I like turned into an investigator. I was like a creature creeping through the forest trying to find the origin of this sound. And I came around the corner and it was this UFO shaped metal thing that I had never even seen. And this was probably back in 2011, I want to say. And then it became my mission to find that instrument, to acquire that instrument. There was something there. I was just like, there's something about that instrument. And I searched and searched, and at the time you couldn't get one. There's no, if you wanted to, you could be on a long waiting list. And it just so happened that through a course of events, I ended up coming into contact with this man, Ryan, on the street, who I got to play his handpan. And when I was walking away, he offered it to me. I was like, yes, yes, I would like that. So that handpan came into my life, and I started basically interacting with it as if it was a force of intelligence that had something to teach me. And all I had to do was listen. And instead of studying music through the realm of the mind and theory, it was more of a process of just letting the muse come through me and teach me. And that led me to many moments of performance. And one night I actually went to a house party, and in the back there was all these people playing music. And I had my handpan. I was like the turtle girl walking around with my handpan on my back. And I sat down, and there was this man, Will, who was playing, an Ngoni. Again, first time I'd ever experienced an instrument like this. It's a West African harp. And it just so happened that his Ngoni was tuned to the same scale as my handpan. They're pentatonic instruments, so they don't have all of the notes. They just have some of them. So you have to play in pretty specific keys when you play these instruments. And I sat down and we started playing, and it was like something locked in, and it was like magic. And we were looking at each other being like, what is happening right now? And it was fall, and the wind was blowing, and the golden leaves were just showering down upon us, and everyone was silent. It was like this very amazing convergence. And he and I then started collaborating and playing a lot of music together and getting on stage and doing all sorts of really fun things. And one year, it was Christmas time, Will had built his own Ngoni. He had learned from a teacher on the East Coast how to build this instrument. One year for Christmas, I said, can I pay you to teach me how to build the instrument instead of buying one from you? And what actually ended up happening was he taught me how to secure the skin. It's a goat skin that goes onto a gourd. It gets tensioned and tacked onto the gourd. He taught me that process, which I definitely needed him to teach me, because I wouldn't have known how to devise that without him teaching me. And then he lent me one of his instruments, and I had grown up in a wood shop. My dad was a woodworker, a furniture builder. He had a wood flooring business. And so my whole childhood was around table saws and chop saws and all the different shop tools. And so I took that instrument and I went to the maker's space in Boulder, and I went home to my father's wood shop in Gunnison, Colorado at the time, and just kind of figured out the dimensions of this instrument and then figured out how to build it, and then assembled it and started plucking it, and it started to sing. And so that instrument was the first, and I played that instrument for quite a while. And then I decided I wanted to make more, because my personality is such that I don't just tread lightly with anything that I do. It's like, if I'm going to play the instrument, I'm going to build the instrument. If I'm a dog lover, I'm going to be a dog trainer. If I love flowers, I'm going to grow them in mass quantities. It's just like, that's what I tend to do. I just go very deep in a particular topic. And so then I went into like, how could I evolve the design of this instrument? And I started building many more versions of it and selling it and refining it, and kind of over time came up with my own style. And it's really quite an interesting instrument, because it's one of the very, very ancient instruments. It predates the need for metal, for steel, right? To get a drum, to hollow out a tree trunk, to make a drum, which is a very ancient instrument. We need metal. And the Ngoni is a gourd, a skin, a stick, and the strings can be made out of winding animal guts, the intestines, very tightly, and stringing them up. And so you don't need any tools, truly, to make these instruments. And so it's a very ancient instrument that comes from West Africa, from Mali. And I've over time, because of building the instrument and the connection that I have with this instrument, I have shifted more away from the handpan, more towards the study of the Ngoni. And it's a beautiful, it's played like a harp. There's no fretting. And it's really interesting because, and I actually have one here I can show you.
Please.
The instrument, it's the only instruments that actually faces your body. When you're playing it, it's sending the sound to you. Whereas like a guitar, it's sending the sound, projecting it outward. With the Ngoni, you hold it and it sings to you and to the space at large. But it's a really special instrument. I'll grab this.
Do we get yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if you're going to be able to hear me, because Zoom tends to mute sounds, but this is the Ngoni. It's a stick, the gourd and the bridge, and then these strings. And this one has 12 strings. And
Wow.
you hold it to where it's facing you like this, and these handles, and then you play it. And yeah, I have a real love of this instrument. It's really special to build this from scratch.
Wow.
Really...
It's as beautiful as a flower. Um, I'm curious. Yeah, it's so beautiful. I'm curious. There's a setting that should be on the top right of your screen called Original Sound for Musicians that if you click it, it turns on instead of off. And we could test if that allows us to hear the sound. Then people get a free sampling of Akacia Rose original Ngoni music and don't even have to come to a Heartfire festival. Um,
Let's see. Okay, I just turned that on. I'm gonna play a note and you can tell me if you can hear it.
yes.
You can hear that?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll play you a little snippet of a traditional song on the Ngoni. It's kind of out of tune, but that's a little.
It's like it's still as beautiful as a flower, but now in terms of sound. Um, yeah. Wow. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We'll have to, I don't know if that does it justice, so we might have to do something live. If you're open to it, we'll arrange a whole concert in Boulder and people can come hear it in person that way. If you decide to agree to that, we can put it together. That was beautiful. So wow, you picked up this instrument. And I'm so glad you spoke to your personality trait of just going all in with things because I was wondering like how does this person make everything themselves? They make the flowers, they make the instruments, they don't just play them. It's like it's pretty fascinating correlation between those somehow. But
I'm
that's
a
so
DIY.
yeah. What'd you say?
I'm a DIYer.
Yeah. And
Yep.
sort of a polymath too and Um, I get it. It's awesome. And it's so cool. So that you work with this instrument, but then you receive this traditional instrument. You just played a traditional melody for us, and the instrument comes from Mali, from West Africa. But as you began learning to build and create them, you made it your own, and you're like inventing a particular style and approach. And do you still sell these? Is this something we can find somewhere if we want an Ngoni?
It's a possibility, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Not
The-
my main focus like it was at one point, but
yeah.
Ayurveda is really my main focus right now. But
Yeah.
yes, it's a possibility.
Yeah, because we have friends too, some good friends out in New York that are involved with an organization called Dig Project, and they're actually supplying these kinds of rare instruments, hand pans and sound healing instruments, and also artisan made crafts. Like there's traditional flute masters and flautists from Peru, the Tito La Rosa's family that create flutes and so there's something interesting there. They organize Dig Project organizes a gathering called Tribal Rhythms. And I hope that they bring it out here to visit us in Colorado from New York. Maybe we can host something on our land. But when they do, it would be perfect to have as many people as we can bring that are experts, musicians, instrument builders, creators of these traditional instruments. And I mean, the fact that it comes from Mali in West Africa is particularly fascinating to me. I think that the traditions and the mystery schools, the initiatic orders in West Africa, are some of the most incredible and fascinating and ancient and interesting in the world. We don't have time to go into that. I might do an episode on it another time, but the griot tradition of the traveling musicians and that would go intertribally from tribe to tribe and give the oral transmission, teach the stories, but in the form of song, and the form of metaphor and poetry with instruments like this. And there's a whole advanced science there to the Dogon tribe and correlations between ancient Egypt and some of these West African tribes and their teachings of alchemy and the elements and so on. It's deep stuff. So if you want to leave us with any closing words, this will be our last moment here. So feel free to chime in with any last uh, insights about that, about West Africa, or anything else you want to share to close us out.
At one point I was living with roommates, and my roommate, who was quite different than I he kept observing my lifestyle. And he was like, wow, you don't ever like sit around and just watch TV. And I realized that, I think that this life, there's so much potential in this life, and our souls really do have like these very specific flavors, and we have these very specific shapes to us that are really perfect for this puzzle piece of life that we are in. And it takes one way we can come home to ourselves is to minimize distraction in our lives. And there's a lot of things in this world that can distract us. And our time and our attention is one of our greatest resources, is what I feel. And it's a piece of the flower farming for me is that in this journey of being dedicated to liberating vitality in my body so that I get to experience the goodness of life as often as I possibly can. What I've realized is that when I'm out in my garden with my hands in the earth, it is the moment when I am the most healthy, alive, well, connected, happy. And so, yeah, we have the opportunity to grow plants from seeds. We have the opportunity to pick up an instrument and learn it. We have the opportunity to dive into how our body speaks to us through the language of symptoms and wellness, but in order for these things to be explored deeply, we have to take the opportunity and take the time. And the distractions that are around us can be really muting to each individual self-actualizing, is what I would call it, right? And so it's something, of course, that we all have to navigate and work with. And it's just, I think that I'm just giving encouragement, like put down the phone and get outside, or do that thing that you want to do that you've been delaying, or whatever it is. Just give yourself to yourself, right? And let that deeper part of you that speaks have time and space to be explored. It doesn't matter if you're fumbling around and you have no idea what you're doing. Eventually babbling becomes language, right? So yeah, that's my last thoughts.
That's such an incredible note to close on. I keep using the word incredible today, but it's not by accident, and I don't always do that. And it's such a great note to close on because I think that's what I'm doing here is doing my best at babbling, and hopefully the babbling becomes something. But thank you for joining us on this podcast as we babble on, and I hope that there's some depth and meaning that continues to emerge from these conversations. So thank you for closing us out with such a practical note. It's a good reminder for me as well, inspiring and empowering. And I pray that this episode can reach many people and benefit them with the profound insights and encouragement that you've shared with all of us today. And I know that I'll take it to heart. So thank you again for
Yeah,
joining.
thank you for inviting me, and I have the same prayer. Now, may this benefit many. and everything that you're doing as well. Thank you for the work that you're doing in this world. It's very profound.
Thank you. All
Yeah.
right. Amen to that. Peace.